Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about EHS auditing of high potency facilities. I have lots of great stuff to show you today, but before we get started, for those of you with a smartphone, I encourage you to take it out and tweet about today's presentation. The Twitter hashtag for today's presentation is hashtag potent audit. So this morning I want to talk to you about just 4 things. I'd like to talk to you about why you should conduct environmental health and safety audits, why planning for the audit is extremely important. We'll then discuss the execution of the audit itself, and finally we'll follow up on why following up on all findings is absolutely critical. I should mention that up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see this icon, which will remind everyone where we are in today's presentation. All right, so before jumping right into the middle of the process of executing an audit, the very first step prior to conducting an audit is to ask yourself the question, why? Why in the world would I want to conduct an audit? Unfortunately, most audits don't start with the question why. Most audits start with a statement. Most audits start with the statement, hey, let's go out and do an audit. Well, why would people do this? Maybe they're doing it because they've been asked to develop some goals and objectives for the year, or perhaps they're doing this because they suspected there are issues. And yes, just maybe, it's because they just got back from a conference similar to this one and heard an amazing speaker talk about auditing and was inspired to do one themselves or contract out one. Unfortunately, many people make this statement and then immediately charge off to start auditing. They do this without prior consideration to all the details and ramifications of having an audit conducted. Let's explore some of the possible answers to that why question. First, ensuring regulatory compliance with governmental standards is one reason why people would want to do environmental health and safety audits of their highly potent facilities. While this might be helpful from a pure compliance standpoint, it's not very helpful when auditing high potency facilities. Sure, you have lots of standards that apply to respiratory protection, chemical hygiene, hazard communication, and other standards, but it's not really going to be much help in the areas of containment validation, contaminant control, toxicology, and the monitoring of active pharmaceutical ingredients. The second reason why people would want to perform an audit is possibly for risk reduction. Maybe you're gearing up to handle a particularly potent compound and you want to make sure that the facility has adequate controls and procedures in place to properly handle that compound. The third reason could be to perform audits is to share best management practices. We don't have a lot of time to go in this today. I will just mention that it's important during audits that not only do you indicate the parts that need improvement, but you should also indicate the parts that are a best management practice so you can share those with other companies. The fourth reason companies would do environmental health and safety audits is to ensure management accountability. Let's talk about this for a minute. Back when I started this career back in the mid-1980s, I was working at a facility or working for a company that took auditing extremely serious. They took it so serious that, in fact, that if a facility scored less than a 90% on their audit, that site manager lost their entire bonus for the year. Their bonus at that time could easily equal their salary. And if they scored less than a 70% on their environmental health and safety audit, that site manager lost their job, no questions asked. So they took auditing very, very seriously. All right, the fifth reason that companies may perform environmental health and safety audits are for contract manufacturing organization or contract research organization selection. Increasingly, this is becoming more and more important. With big pharma companies and virtual pharma companies outsourcing their smaller and often more potent product lines to CMOs and CROs, it's imperative that you know that the facility has the capabilities to protect their employees. Furthermore, if these facilities are in foreign countries without much of a regulatory structure or access to trained occupational health and safety professionals, if you don't perform at least a baseline audit, it could be a huge liability for your company. The sixth reason that companies may conduct an audit is for acquisition or divestiture of facilities. On the acquisition side, it's more of knowing what you're getting into prior to buying another company. And on the divestiture side, it's more or less documenting the current condition of that facility before you offload it. The seventh reason is for management systems. With initiatives like the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, ISO 14001, ISO 18001, one of the key areas is auditing. Most of these management systems follow a plan, do, check, act type of process. And so auditing is a key component. The eighth and final reason for conducting an audit is to establish a baseline. Personally, for me, this is one of the most important reasons to conduct an audit. If you've just been hired at a new company, rather than running around and trying to tend to everyone's wishes, one of the first things you should do is conduct a baseline audit. This can't be your typical check-the-box type of audit. It has to be something done more at a high level and more strategic in nature. Once the audit is conducted, then you can establish a plan to prioritize issues to attack and budget for it. It's been my experience in over 27 years of auditing that in general, if you have a major issue after you've been with the company after about 6 months or so, then they're going to be pointing at you for that issue. So it's critical to get those issues identified early and communicated to senior management, put together plans, prioritize, and start putting together your budgets to get those items corrected. All right, so that's the reasons why you're going to do an audit. And that's very, very important because it can definitely change the scope and your approach to the audit. Next, we're going to talk about the planning phase of the audit. But before we do that, let's talk about the three different phases of the audit process. There's basically three main phases of the audit. They're the planning for the audit, the execution of the audit, and the follow-up. I'll go through each of these in greater detail, but from my years of experience of conducting or participating in audits, the execution portion of the audit actually takes the least amount of time, and the planning and follow-up take the most. With that said, let's return back to the planning phase. Now, the first part of the planning phase of the audit is to obtain senior management support. And of course, this is one of these situations where you always have to say, be careful what you ask for. Getting management support is great, but if you're driving the process, you're going to be expected to perform and you're going to be expected to execute. I've performed several audits that have gone very, very wrong, not because of what I did, but because numerous findings that were unexpected and serious were discovered. And the audits just became big money pits with tight deadlines and ended up costing several people their jobs. So when you're obtaining management support, be sure that you consider the budget for the time, travel, and consultants. You get senior management's commitment to review the draft report. You correct those findings or get their commitment to correct those findings, not only in the short term, but also in a sustainable fashion. And then you should also consider business disruption. Now, this is very important. And you want to have what is your backup plan if you audit a critical vendor or supplier, such as a contract manufacturer, and you have significant findings. Do you to pull the plug on that supplier and possibly disrupt your supply chain? And if that supplier has limited resources, who is going to pay to correct those findings? I was talking to one of my clients the other day about auditing, and they're a CMO, and he indicated that many companies that audit them won't even give them their findings. They will just either say you passed or you failed. So that's important. The second consideration during the planning phase is legal considerations. Several items here are important to consider. First, you'll need to ask yourself the question, should I conduct the audit under the doctrine of client-attorney privilege information or client-attorney work product? This is very important if you have a gut feeling that there may be significant regulatory violations or litigation is looming on the horizon. Second, you'll want to brush up on federal and state laws on self-reporting of audit findings. Self-reporting of audit findings usually can help reduce some of those or sometimes even eliminate monetary penalties. But these policies usually state very, very specific criteria for self-reporting and strict deadlines. I know that both OSHA and the EPA here in the United States have these policies available offline, so I would submit that you should visit those and review those. And finally, from a legal standpoint, if you're a publicly held company, you may want to talk to the senior executives about any potential Sarbanes-Oxley considerations. While SOX was not motivated by environmental issues, it was written so broadly that any issue that is material in nature could be considered. Issues could be considered material if it's something that a reasonable investor would want to know about. But other issues such as compliance with regulatory requirements or concealment of an unlawful act could possibly be considered a potential SOX issue. One key area discussed in SOX, and I touched on it earlier, is auditor independence, which basically means you can't use the same firm that audited your facility to provide expert services. Personally, when I'm conducting audits, I'm extremely careful to stick to the audit process and not even discuss potential follow-up work based on the findings. To me, that's another discussion to be discussed at a later time after the audit process is completed. Continuing on with legal considerations, additional items to watch out for: record just the facts, not opinions and not speculations. Avoid omitting violations or pointing blame at specific individuals. I cringe every time I see an audit report where somebody states the company was in violation of a certain citation, regulatory citation. That's not for you to determine. You can put it down as a finding, but not put it down as a violation. You might document it at the time of the audit. Documentation of fit testing was missing or was not available. So that's something very important. Of course, always be truthful. Don't ever attempt to cover up any findings. Consider a retention policy for your audit documents and reports. Handwritten notes should be shredded once the final report is issued. Be careful with email correspondence. Careful and controlled auditing of the draft report is important. Take report writing very, very seriously and only expect a mistake-free report. Seek legal counsel as appropriate, particularly if there are significant findings. All right, so now we figured out the why. You've been successful at securing management support, and you worked through all the legal considerations. It's now time to put together and prepare your audit team. Even if you're using outside consultants to perform the audit, you still should have some sort of internal team to assist in the process. Be careful here. Often, if you ask for volunteers, you will get lots of people to raise their hands, but make sure they have the right skills and they're doing it for the right reasons. Some people do it for the right reasons because they like to travel on the company's expense. Everybody wants to go to an audit in La Jolla, California in the middle of the summer, but nobody wants to go to an audit in August in the middle of Arkansas. Depending upon the scope of the audit, you may need to get several people to get the audit done in a reasonable amount of time. You also want auditors that have independence and that the amount of or lack of findings will not have any impact on their professional advancement. You want auditors that will follow the process. These auditors should also be free of any conflict of interest. In other words, having auditors find a lot of findings so they can drive up consulting billings from expert services is never, ever a good practice. You also want auditors that have appropriate training in auditing. This is extremely rare, and this may be something that you'll have to do internally. You also may want to rotate audit members through for several reasons. First, it's often nice to get a fresh set of eyes looking at the facility. And secondly, because of the demands of auditing, I know very few people that can withstand the demands of full-time auditing for more than several years. Let's talk a minute about auditor skill sets. You're going to need people that are critical thinkers. Critical thinkers are basically people that won't accept things at face value or won't accept weak arguments. You're going to need people that can synthesize lots of information. They may be bringing information in from written documentation, reports, regulatory texts, written programs, and they got to bring it all together to determine is the facility meeting the requirement. You're going to need auditors that can work very long hours. Auditing is not an 8 to 5 job. Typically, you'll get to the site early, you'll work all day, maybe take a break for lunch. You typically quit about 5 o'clock, but then you'll go to dinner, and then after dinner, if you're doing it right, you should be working on your draft report, putting together the findings from that day. You also need people that can be productive while traveling. A good auditor is reading documentation and finalizing their plan on the way to the audit on the plane, and then on the way back, they're finalizing the second draft. They need to have great interpersonal skills. They need to be able to ask questions to site personnel without coming across as arrogant, all-knowing, or condescending. This is a difficult type of skill. They need to be able to handle people that can be confrontational. So this is an important point to bring up. Once you've selected your team member, you want to prepare your audit protocols and checklists. While at first you might believe that protocols and checklists are the same, they're not. Protocols are documents that describe things like how often you'll audit a facility, the approach for ranking findings, distribution and control of the draft report, procedures for immediate hazards and critical findings, etc. You'll also want to prepare document request forms to send out to the facility prior to the audit. Document request forms can be pretty much developed and used over and over again, but these will be forms that contain a list of documents that you want for every single audit ahead of time. These would be things like chemical hygiene plans, control banding schemes, etc. Next, you'll want to establish a finding priority scheme. Some people like high, medium, low, or something similar. I personally like A, B, C, D, where A is a critical finding that could result in a fatality or could or is causing significant environmental harm. B are regulatory violations or things that could cause health and safety issues. C's are usually just paperwork or documentation issues. And D's are typically your gaps in your written programs or implementation of those programs, such as not doing what you say you're doing. Next, you and your team want to hash out procedures for what I like to call fix-it findings. Fix-it findings are things like when you walk into a laboratory, say you have 8 employees in that laboratory and 5 of the 8 employees are not wearing their safety glasses or lab coats as required by their written SOP, and then they scurry around because they see the auditors and they put on their proper personal protective equipment. Is that a finding? Do you document that? Another example would be blocked fire extinguishers. That's a very simple thing where somebody Somebody would come in and there's a code or something in front of a fire extinguisher and they move it out of the way. Just-in-time compliance is kind of tricky. Say you send out your document request form and then you get these documents back, but you notice that the creation date is the date after you sent out the document request form. So in other words, until you asked for it, they didn't have the SOP or procedure, and they scurried around and put it together between the time you requested it and the time the actual audit occurs. Repeat findings are things that occurred on previous audits or corrective action plans. So that's the planning phase of the audit. Let's now move on to the execution phase of the audit. As I indicated earlier, I generally think the execution phase of the audit is actually the easiest part. At approximately 1 month out from the audit, you're going to want to coordinate with the site and formally notify them of the schedule. You'll also want them to receive a pre-audit document request form, which should list all the documents that you would like to receive at least a week or two in advance. You'll then want to review these documents once you receive them and determine where there might be significant gaps or items that you're going to want to focus on when you're doing the audit. You're also going to want to review various compliance databases. The ones I like are the OSHA's Establishment Search Database, where all OSHA inspection information is stored. There's also the EPA's ECHO database, which stands for Environmental Compliance History Online. And review those databases, and many times you'll find findings that occurred historically that the site may not even be aware of them. If necessary or appropriate, you may want to request copies of past regulatory inspection reports. Typically, you can do a Freedom of Information Act request and get those reports. All right, well, once you're on site, the things you're going to want to do is conduct an opening conference where you'll introduce key personnel. You're going to review the schedule for the week. You want to schedule any key interviews. You want to determine if there's any significant events going on. You want to discuss your fix-it finding approach and how you're going to handle that. You want to tell them that known issues will be findings. So what am I talking about here? Well, typically during the course of an audit, you'll have something that you observe and you'll hear the site say, yeah, we know about that. We're working on it. Well, just because they're working on it does not make it not a finding. I've had people that were working on things for well over 7 years, and they still haven't got it resolved. So it's very important that known issues will be findings. You want to discuss how severe or critical findings would be should be approached. My perfect example here is, what if you observe somebody entering a permitted confined space without the proper controls and procedures in place, that it could be a possible risk? Do you stop work? How do you handle that? You want to discuss if recommendations should be in the final report. Typically, I don't like recommendations in the final report. I believe that recommendations should be in the corrective action plan, not in the final report. It's up for the site to put together recommendations. You are there to have findings, not recommendations. You can help put together the corrective action plan, but really audits are all about findings. You want to discuss personal protective equipment or other special requirements for the auditors. For example, if you're auditing an aseptic facility, there might have to be some training that will occur ahead of time. And then, of course, you want to set the time for the closing conference, which typically occurs mid-morning on the final day that you're on site. Then let's see, other observations and findings you want to look at. Typically, once the opening conference has been conducted, you'll want to move on to this observation phase. This consists mostly of going around the site and observing specific activities and observations that you may have identified during the document review. One comment here, you see this gentleman's picture, and I always wonder why every facility has someone that looks like this person. All right, well, anyway, you want to compare what the written documents say they'll do and what their actual practice is. You want to be very, very specific in your findings. Don't use general terms like all or never. All findings should be defensible. Cite specific regulatory standards where possible. Even if you're dealing with potent compound safety and there's not a regulatory standard, they may have an SOP, or if it's a corporation with multiple facilities, they may have some global corporate guidelines. Use numbers where possible. A good example here is back to our fix-it finding, where 5 of 8 employees were not wearing the proper personal protective equipment. You may want to state it exactly like that. Again, don't state opinion as fact. If it's an opinion, say so. Digital images are extremely helpful. However, you may need to get site approval before using those images. And then, of course, you want to prioritize and rank all findings according to your procedure that you put together when preparing for the audit. During the observation part of the execution phase, you'll want to look for some common findings that you may have experienced from other audits. Based on my 27 years experience in auditing high-potency facilities, here's a few of the common findings. The first one that's most common is lack of effective engineering controls. Improper use of engineering controls. A good example of that is people using snorkels or elephant trunk type of ventilation devices. They have them typically way too far away from the source of contamination. Absence or lack of contaminant or containment validation data, absence of potent compound classification reports, lack of potent compound safety training for maintenance personnel and contractors, and lack of compound-specific hazard communication training or training utilizing very poorly written MSDSs. It's been my experience that most MSDSs for APIs are very poorly written with a lot of don't knows, not available type of information, even though if they looked, they could find it. So, that's something you may want to discuss. Here at Affygility Solutions, we often find that preparing training guides for APIs really help meet that hazard communication training requirement for specific APIs. Other common findings: use of nuisance dust standard for potent compounds. While that might work for category 1 and 2 compounds, it's going to be completely useless for category 3 and higher. Random selection of respiratory protection. We'll often see some people in a facility wearing half face in one activity, and right across the suite they're wearing a full face and another person's wearing a PAPR, and they can't provide any documentation why they're using certain types of respirators. Lack of industrial hygiene data to support respirator selection. IH data lacking during ancillary activities such as filter changing. Poor work practices in laboratories, such as food and drink in laboratories, and proper labeling, bottles stored on the floor, etc. Very common findings in any type of laboratory, but more important in a potent compound safety facility. Also, poor work practices when handling potent compounds in powders, weighing hoods, and the like. Inadequate procedures for post-batch entry into production suites. This is where once the batch has been run, are people allowed to enter that suite before it's received a thorough clean? All right, so throughout the course of the audit, you should have been working on your draft report at the end of each day, so that at the end of the evening prior to the final day, you'll have a completed draft report to submit to key people at the closing conference. Some key things here: you want to submit that draft report at the closing conference. You want to create a list of every single document you examine and all personnel involved. both name and title. You want to create that table of findings with the priority. The main thought here, if it's not in the draft audit report, it's not a finding. Nothing makes people more angry than you go through the draft audit report, then you take it back and you add all these additional findings. So when they get the second draft, they have 10 more findings than they had in the draft report that was submitted at the closing conference. That's not a good practice. So let's talk a little bit about the closing conference. You want to have a presentation mostly pre-prepared, but you can finalize it the night before with some of your key findings. You want to distribute that draft report, but remember, keep it controlled. You want to expect and encourage site personnel to challenge findings. I like it when people challenge the findings, because if I don't have to document the report and then immediately delete it later because it's not a finding, I prefer that. Have them challenge it. If they can produce documentation or be willing to submit some sort of information that will make it not a finding, that's great. It's okay that if you have an item that you're not sure whether it'll be a finding or not, it's okay to say it might be a possible finding and additional research is needed. Indicate a time frame for when the second draft report is to be submitted and stick to that time frame. All right, so that was the execution phase of the audit. Let's now move on to the fourth phase and the final phase of auditing, and that is follow-up. So by now you're likely absolutely exhausted and you know you're behind on work at the office. But unfortunately, audit work is far, far from over. Now comes the most critical portion of the audit, and that's your follow-up. Like I said earlier in today's presentation, don't audit if you don't plan on correcting anything. So what you want to do here when you get back to office, you want to finalize that priority of findings. Again, be careful with recommendations. I recommend that any recommendation that you have is in the corrective action plan, not in the audit report. You want to prepare a great executive summary. Your executive summary should be no longer than 2 pages long and should just have the key points. You don't need to really discuss category D findings in detail. You want to submit that draft report, that second draft, as promised. Revisions should be based on your comments or comments that were collected, and ensure that all findings are entered into a corrective action tracking system. Affygility Solutions has a corrective action tracking system called AffyTrack, and many of our clients use it to track their corrective actions, and it works great for them. It's a web-based tool that's secure, and if you'd like more information on AffyTrack, feel free to contact us. There's contact information at the end of the presentation. All right, so in summary, we discussed with you why you need to do an audit, the planning, the execution, and the follow-up phases of the audit. Let's go ahead and sum things up. First off, know why you're auditing. Don't even start if you don't have a reason why. Obtain management support first. Again, don't audit if you don't plan on correcting anything. Planning is critical. The on-site activities generally take the least amount of time, and take report writing very, very seriously. Don't accept anything less than a perfect report. And then prioritize and correct. That's the keys to auditing. So I'd like to end today's presentation with one of my most favorite Dilbert cartoons. And through careful planning, execution, and follow-up, I sincerely hope that this doesn't happen to you. All right, so we're nearing the end of our time, but we do have a little bit of time to take a few questions. If you'd like to contact Affygility Solutions, there's numerous ways you can. You can email me. You can follow Affygility Solutions on Twitter. We do have a LinkedIn account. Just go there and give us a like or a follow. Facebook, go there and give us a like. You can search Google Plus for Affygility Solutions. And then you can also go to our podcasts, which are available through our website as well as iTunes, and search for Biopharma EH&S. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I will be at the lunch break, so if you want to have any further questions, feel free to stop me. Thank you.